Somewhere in northern France, in the autumn of 1915, a man pulled a small pocket notebook from inside his uniform and began to write. His name was Captain Charles Campbell May. He was 26 years old, a journalist before the war, a husband, a father to a daughter he had barely held, and he was breaking military law by writing any of this down. Keeping a personal diary on the Western Front was a court-martial offense. Command feared the notebooks of dead men falling into enemy hands. But Charlie May could not stop himself. He had been a writer before the bullets, and he would be one after them for as long as after remained. By the end of 1915, the Western Front had solidified into something that defied military logic and human imagination. A line of trenches, 440 miles long, cut across France and Belgium like a wound that refused to close. On one side, the Allied forces, British, French, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders. On the other, the German Imperial Army. Between them, a strip of devastated earth called No Man's Land. And in between those two lines, hundreds of thousands of men waited, dug in, endured. This is not a story about grand strategy or generals in dry headquarters. This is a story about what it took to survive a single day, in the mud, in the cold, in the trenches of the Western Front. Every day in the trenches began the same way. Before the sun rose, before rations were handed out, before any man was permitted to eat or rest or speak above a whisper, there was stand to. At the first gray light of dawn, every soldier on the line was ordered to his post, rifle in hand, bayonet fixed, eyes trained on the darkness of no man's land. This was the most dangerous moment of the day. Dawn was when attacks came, when the enemy, who had survived the same cold night on the other side of the wire, might decide this morning was the morning to push forward. So every man stood, watched, waited. Charlie May recorded what those mornings felt like. Not the fear, though fear was always there, but the strange suspended quality of that hour. He wrote of standing at the parapet, watching the light come in over a land stripped of every living thing. No trees left standing, no birds, no movement except the distant pop of a sniper's rifle somewhere down the line. Stand 2 lasted roughly 30 minutes. When the officers were satisfied the enemy was not advancing, the order came: stand down. And only then, only after the threat of death had been formally acknowledged and dismissed, were the men permitted to begin their day. In the trenches, routine was survival. After stand 2 came the rum ration, a small standard-issue measure handed down the line by the officers. For many men, it was the only warmth they would feel before noon. Then came the morning inspection. Officers moved along the trench, checking the condition of each man's rifle, not as a formality but as a necessity. A rifle clogged with mud did not fire. A man whose rifle did not fire was a dead man. Trench conditions were so wet, so thick with clay and filth that weapons required constant maintenance simply to function. The trench itself was a world unto itself. A narrow corridor, roughly 6 feet deep and 2 to 3 feet wide, reinforced with timber frames and sandbags. The floor was lined with wooden slats, called duck boards, intended to keep men out of the standing water below. They rarely succeeded entirely. The smell of a trench was something no memoir writer could fully capture. Mud, chloride of lime, used as disinfectant, rotting wood, unwashed men who had not seen a bath in weeks. And underneath all of it, always, the smell of decay, of the dead, who were everywhere and could not always be retrieved. Charlie May wrote in one entry that he had grown so accustomed to the smell that he only noticed it when a breeze carried something different, the distant scent of grass or rain on open ground. And then the absence of that smell felt like a wound. Breakfast, when it came, was carried up from the rear in insulated containers called Dixies. Typically, tea, hard biscuits, and occasionally bacon or a tin of bully beef. The food was often cold by the time it arrived. It was often late, and there was often not enough of it. But the men ate. And in eating, in the mundane civilian act of sitting with another man and sharing a meal, they reminded themselves quietly that they were still human. The popular image of trench warfare is one of constant, unrelenting combat. The reality was different, and in some ways, harder. Most days there was no attack, no charge across no man's land, no battle. Most days there was only waiting. And waiting, as Charlie May observed, was its own form of violence. He wrote in the weeks before the Somme offensive, "Waiting is rotten. I think it tries the nerves more than the actual movement of assault. Then one has action, movement, 100 things to strive for. But in waiting, there is nothing but anxiety and fruitless speculation on every phase conceivable." To fill the hours, men found what they could: cards, letters home, improvised football matches in the rear areas where the ground was flat enough and the shelling distant enough. Charlie May wrote of afternoons spent riding along the Somme Valley on horseback, of lunches in Amiens, of an elaborate Christmas dinner in 1915 that the officers of B Company somehow managed to organize, which he recorded with a journalist's pleasure for detail. These were not escapes from the war. There was no escape. They were the mechanisms by which men held themselves together across the long, featureless days between the moments of terror. Brotherhood was not a concept in the trenches. It was a condition of survival. The men who fought alongside Charlie May, the Manchester Pals, were not strangers thrown together by bureaucratic assignment. Many had enlisted together from the same streets, the same factories, the same football clubs. They had volunteered as a group. They trained as a group. They shipped to France as a group. To watch one of them die was not simply to witness a casualty of war. It was to lose a neighbor, a schoolmate, the man who had sat across from you at the same pub table the summer before the world went wrong. Charlie wrote often of his men, their jokes, their complaints, their small acts of courage and kindness. He wrote of a private named Arthur Bunting, his Batman, and over time his friend, a man who would prove, before the summer was out, the full weight of that friendship. The physical conditions of the Western Front are well documented. The mud, the rats, some grown to the size of cats, feeding on what the battlefield provided. Trench foot, a fungal decay of the flesh brought on by weeks of standing in cold, wet conditions, which left men unable to walk. Lice, which lived in the seams of every uniform and could not be fully eradicated. But the conditions of the mind are harder to quantify. In 1914, the British Army had no clinical framework for psychological trauma. The condition that would later be called shell shock, and much later, post-traumatic stress disorder, was not officially recognized. Men who could no longer function after sustained bombardment were often accused of cowardice. Some were court-martialed, some were executed. The sound of artillery, sustained over hours and days, did something to the human nervous system that no one in command seemed prepared to address. Men described losing the ability to feel their own faces, tremors that would not stop, dreams that were indistinguishable from the waking hours. Charlie May did not write often about fear in direct terms. He wrote around it, in the way he cataloged small pleasures with unusual intensity, as though banking them against something coming. In the way he addressed his diary to his wife, Maud, as if she were in the room. In the way certain entries stopped abruptly, mid-thought, and resumed hours or days later without explanation. The gap in the page said what the words did not. By late June 1916, Charlie May and the Manchester Pals had been in France for 8 months. The British High Command had been planning a massive offensive along the Somme for months, the largest military operation in British history. Charlie knew what was coming. The men knew, and still, they waited. On June 28th, he wrote, "We were all ready and anxious to get away, to get up and moving and down with the waiting." The bombardment preceding the assault had been running for 7 days. 1.5 million artillery shells fired at the German lines. The sound could be heard across the Channel, in southern England. Officers assured the men that nothing could survive such a barrage, that the wire would be cut, that the enemy would be broken. On the night of June 30th, Charlie May made the last full entry in his diary. He had received a letter from Maud that day. He described the morning, calling it glorious. He wrote of his men, their readiness. And then, at the end, "I trust they will not claim too many of our lads before the day is over." Those were his final written words. At 7:30 in the morning on July 1st, 1916, the whistles blew across the British lines. Charlie May went over the top with his men, B Company, 22nd Manchester Pals, into the open ground, toward the German wire. Within 10 minutes, they had reached the first enemy trench. Then a German shell hit. Charlie May went down. His Batman, Private Arthur Bunting, turned back. Under sustained fire for 3 hours, Bunting stayed beside his captain, trying to bandage wounds too severe to close, eventually managing to drag him back to the British lines. Charlie May died of his wounds. He was 27 years old. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British Army suffered approximately 57,000 casualties in a single day. Charlie May was one of 379 men from his regiment alone. Private Arthur Bunting retrieved the 7 small notebooks from beside his captain's body. He wrapped them carefully, and he mailed them home to Maud, together with news of her husband's death. The diaries were placed in an attic. They remained there for 80 years. When Charlie May's great-nephew finally transcribed them, what he found was not a document of military history. It was something far simpler and far harder to set down. The record of a man who refused to stop being a person in a place designed to make him nothing but a soldier. He wrote jokes. He recorded meals. He described the countryside between bombardments as beautiful, because it was. He wrote to his wife as though the distance between them was temporary, manageable, the kind of distance that letters could bridge. He kept writing because to stop writing was to let the war have all of him. In that, he was not exceptional. He was one of millions. The Western Front consumed an entire generation. But inside that consumption, in the mud and the waiting and the terrible silences between the guns, men like Charlie May built something the war could not entirely destroy. Friendships, routines, words on a page, the evidence that they were here, that they endured, that they were, above all, human. If this story stayed with you, it should. These were real men, real names, real notebooks pulled from real mud. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, told exactly as they happened, without embellishment, without mythology, just history and the people inside it.